Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today I'll be talking to you on peasant movements in India. This particular module is part of the larger module on social movements in India. I am Dr. Shoma Chaudhary Lahiri. I teach sociology in the Department of Sociology, St. Xavier's College, Kolkata. This particular module will specifically address a range of issues raised by the peasant movements in India since historical times. It also enables students to have a historical understanding of the processes of social transformation and the role that the peasants have played in it in history. The objective of the module is to familiarize the student with the critical aspects of the movement and to focus on the ideological diversity in the peasant movement, to look at the various forms of protests in which the peasants have indulged themselves, and to also focus on the social significance of the peasant movements in India. Peasant movements have a long history going back to the colonial period. Now the term peasant is rather complex because it hides many differentiations within. The term peasant includes different kinds of cultivators who have vested interests in land, namely small cultivator, rich landlords, landless laborers who are hired to cultivate land, sharecroppers, and such other groups who regard land as a source of livelihood. So the term peasant, which translates as khedut or kisan in the regional language, does not really reflect the diversity within. Hence, it is found to be inadequate by the social scientists like Ghanshyam Shah, who have written on the peasant movement. Another notion which is widely contested by the peasant movement is the Western idea that the peasantry in India is not revolutionary. In fact, writers like social scientists like Barrington Moore, Eric Stokes, and others have designated the Indian peasantry as fatalistic, as lacking in revolutionary potential, as groups who are like potatoes amidst a sack of potatoes. This is drawing from Marxist terminology of designating the lack of class consciousness amongst the peasantry. However, a number of studies, namely by D.N. Dhanagre, by Kathleen Gao, by A.R. Desai, and such other social scientists who have documented various struggles, peasant struggles, in different parts of the country, right from the colonial times, show that this has not been really the case. The Indian peasant has revolted over many issues during the colonial period, and we will soon talk about the variety of issues around which we have had peasant-based mobilizations. We go on to talk about the various typologies into which movements have been classified. Typologies are ways in which a large mass of data is classified in such a manner so that some kind of an order evolves out of the chaos. And hence, social scientists have used typological classifications of social movements to make sense of the various kinds of movements that groups have been involved in. However, typologies are not foolproof. Although typologizing enables us to understand specific phenomenon better, but still there are limits that that typologizing poses to our understanding of social movements. I'll talk a little bit about the various ways in which peasant movements have been classified by social scientists, and then go on to talk about the limits of typologizing. So peasant movements have been classified as occurring in the pre-British or colonial period and in the post-independence period. Some movements have been, some scientists have classified movements on the basis of pre-Naxalbari and post-Naxalbari movements occurring in these two different phases. Another kind of classification is we come across is in terms of pre-Green Revolution and post-Green Revolution movements, whereby post-Green Revolution movements, the character of the peasant movements differ. In fact, the character of the peasant movements are said to be different depending upon the variability of the political regimes. So Dipankar Gupta, for example, talks about peasant movements in terms of two kinds of peasant movements, one being of traditionally categorizing it as peasant movement, the post-independence, in the post-independence period he calls them farmers movements. Gail Omwet also talks of a classification whereby old peasant movements are raising issues which were important in the colonial period, whereas the new movements, peasant movements are farmers movements. A.R. Desai again goes on to classify peasant movements on the basis of movements which are, he calls them peasant movements and agrarian movements, whereby peasant movements refer to the issues of the peasantry in the colonial period, whereas the issues raised by peasant proprietors, rich landlords, middle peasants in the post-independence period are termed as agrarian movements. However, what is important to recognize is that is the continuity in the idea of the continuity in the fact that peasant movements have occurred in history, though the character, the nature of actors, the issues that they have raised are different. Typologies are merely attempts to impose a certain kind of an order on this vast range of data. Now the limits, when we talk about the limits of typologizing, I would take the example of Ramchandra Guha, who went on to study the movement which has now become synonymous with one of the early environmental movements in our country, namely the Chipko movement in the 1970s in the Uttarakhand region. However, if one looks at the nature of actors in the Chipko movement, most of them were cultivators, peasant cultivators who owned land and who were protesting against the taking away of the land which they cultivated by the state and giving it away to a sports company who had the intention of planting eucalyptus trees so that the wood of these trees could be used for making bats, used for sports purposes. And so initially the people who protested as part of the Chipko movement were peasant movement, but Chipko movement has been hailed as one of the early environmental movements in our country. So often we find that the limits of typologizing here, we see significant overlaps between concerns of the peasant and of the peasants in the region and the attempt to safeguard the ecology of the region by women. by hugging the trees, which came to be termed as chipko. So therefore, how would one classify? Should one classify on the basis of actors, or should one classify on the basis of issues remains. I go on to talk about the different issues that the peasant movements have raised, and historically they have, all the issues have been quite significant. So in the colonial period, peasants came together around a range of issues which involved say for example changes in property relations, issues of begar or forced labor, sometimes religious and economic issues came together, which I'll go on to explain. I'll give examples. The British transformed Indian agriculture. They created property rights in land. They also commercialized they commercialized land, and which changed the relations that people had in around land, and they inserted the Indian economy, which was based on the subsistence mode of production, into the capitalist market economy, and gradually the reciprocal relations, subsistent relations gave way to more exploitative relations, which were based on the notion of profit, emergence of new classes like the class of zamindars in different parts of the country, and that sort of brought peasants together, pitted the peasant cultivators against each other, led to the emergence of categories of middle peasant, landless laborer. It created rights in land. So that is one kind of protest that we see in the colonial period. Another kind of protest that one witnesses in the colonial period was around the issue of famine. Famine was a recurrent part of social life, and often the people who were worst affected were the rural poor, and they, along with issues like forced labor or begar, in which the rural peasantry was involved, often brought them together, and they protested in different parts of the country. Forced labor was used to construct roads, to construct dams, to supply water, and to the landlords, to the kings, and this has been a regular feature. Protest against begar has been a regular feature in colonial period. Another kind of reason for protest was rise of prices of food grains, inferior quality food grains which were supplied to the peasant, to the rural poor, also brought them together during periods of scarcity and famine, and many peasant movements occurred as a result. Immediate reasons could also be the coming together of religious and economic issues, as one witnesses in the Malabar region, where the peasant movements were often given a communal color, where Muslim peasants rose up against Hindu landlords, but such divisions were not very clear, because the peasantry was also protesting against Muslim landlords in certain cases. In post-independence period, the nature of the peasant movement changed. The issues, some of the issues continued, while new forms of conflict emerged. But what is significant about the peasant movement are two very interesting phenomena. One is the way in which the peasant movements were linked to the larger national movement by the initiative of Mahatma Gandhi and Sardar Patel. For example, in the Champaran Satyagraha and in the Kheda Satyagraha, they urged the peasants to participate in social reform, to build schools, to work for the larger good, and so on. And the second interesting dimension about the peasant participation or peasant protests was the participation of women in peasant movements. For example, in Awadh, Kapil Kumar has documented that women participated in large numbers. In Telangana, women participated in large numbers. In Tebhaga, also Tebhaga movement in Bengal, women participated in large numbers, came together to form Nari Bahini, or troops of women, and because the women were paid less. Women worked on land, but they were paid less. So they were protesting against these patriarchal norms. Even in the post-independence period in the Naxalbari region, when we had the peasant protests in late 1960s, there were the women, the village women also participated along with the men. And what attracted the participation of women was the fact that the peasant movements in certain cases like Telangana and Naxalbari and Tebhaga, they were challenging not only the exploitative structure in which the peasants found themselves, but also the patriarchal norms which the women had to, which the women challenged. So these movements provided a context for even challenging patriarchal norms which were exploitative towards the women. Peasant movement in the post-independence period takes on a different character. While in the colonial period, the movements were directed against the zamindars and the jagirdars, in the post-independence period, as Rajendra Singh reminds us, that most of these peasant movements are now located in the context of civil society, because of and marked by the emergence of very aggressive middle class peasantry, who now direct their ire against the state and demand more and more gains, which are then reflected in the farmers movements, and they are also counterposed against the rural landless laborers who do not have adequate land to cultivate. So the nature of the peasant movement undergoes a change in the post-independence period. This is ironical because such movements emerge in the larger context of the failure of the developmental policy of the state, failure of the land reforms, the increasing democratic participation of people, the emergence of new kinds of conflicts, the emergence of new classes of people like the middle peasants, who are then not satisfied with whatever the state has given them. They are the new kulaks, and they are willing to pressurize the state into granting them remunerative prices, into granting them subsidies, and they have lowering the electricity prices, and they forge links with the the category of the landlords, and they are willing to press further. In this, they are quite opposed to the small peasants or to the landless laborers who then feel oppressed by the middle peasant category itself. The middle peasant as a category had a lot of potential, but they join hands with the rich peasants, and they launch different kinds of movements in the post-independence period. The context is such that there is large-scale commercialization of agriculture, but this commercialization of agriculture does not affect the fate of peasantry as a whole. It affects some categories of peasants positively, while it leaves out a large category of small peasants and landless laborers whose vested interests also lie in land. There is another category of movements that we see in the post-independence period, and that is led by Vinoba Bhave, who is inspired by Gandhi's ideals of Sarvodaya and Satyagraha, and these are largely pacifist in character. Vinoba Bhave believed that it is possible to lead to an alternative form of society through peaceful means, and the kind of initiative that Bhudan and Gramdan movement undertook in the 1950s and after was directly opposed to the initiatives of the communist movement, which was violent in character. So in fact, the post-independence period in India witnesses a large kind of an ideological diversity in peasant movements in India. So on one hand, you have movements inspired by the left ideology, which take a violent sort of character as evident in the Tebhaga and the Telangana movement. Then you have the Bhudan and the Gramdan movement led by Vinoba Bhave and inspired by Gandhian ideals of Satyagraha, Sarvodaya, and so on. And a third category of movements which are then seen in very localized regions, inspired by Alan Turing's idea of identity-oriented movements. An interesting aspect about peasant movement is that peasant protests took many different forms. So in his study, Dhanagre in 1983 talks about how peasant protests were of a constitutional nature, in the sense that it took the form of no tax, no rent campaigns, and one witnesses that the peasant protests ranged from such constitutional agitations to even violent forms of protests. And the other thing about peasant protests is that within the same movement one witnesses different phases. In different phases, peasants protested in different manner. So therefore, in the Telangana movement, one witnesses that peasants initially were peaceful and they were fighting for social reform, but gradually as many rich landlords deserted the movement, the nature of peasant protest turned violent and even led to the seizure of lands. Similarly, in the Tebhaga movement also, one of the novel ways of protesting in the Tebhaga movement was when the actual peasant workers, peasant cultivators took the produce to their own areas, and they sort of they harvested the produce, demanding that 1/3 of their produce should come to them. They willingly give away a part of their produce without any protest, without retaining it, and they only kept 1/3 of the produce that they harvested. Another form of protest was refusing to harvest crops in the Tebhaga movement. The act of just refusing to harvest the crops was also something novel as far as the Tebhaga movement was concerned. In addition, peasants participated in public demonstrations, in strikes, and in such other forms of protests. Dhanagale finds that while the rich peasants were more oriented towards nationalist agitations and non-violent forms of protests, the poor peasants were willing to participate in millenarian struggles, insurrectionary protests, and so on. Another aspect which has arisen in the recent times is this trend of which was popularized by T.K. Uman, when he said that generally social movement studies have privileged organized forms of protests. Everyday forms of protests by peasants have not been studied as part of social movements at all. And he says that these everyday forms of resistance also go on to constitute the larger peasant movement or the movement under consideration, and hence should be considered as part of peasant movements at large. Now, in order to, if I were to sum up the peasant movements, there are a few issues that the peasant movements sort of have brought to light. One of the things which remains significant is the fact that the peasant movements have effectively challenged certain myths, certain dominant understanding regarding the category of the Indian peasant. The myriad struggles, the nature of struggles, the widespread struggles have emphasized that the Indian peasant is not a docile character. He has a revolutionary potential, and he is interested in economic empowerment. The other category, the other thing that the peasant movements have brought to light is that historically, as a historical category, what was thought, what was alleged, that the peasant as a category is about to vanish with modernization, is not going to happen. As long as land continues to be the source of subsistence, peasants as a category will also continue. In fact, new forms of peasant movements are being seen as all around the world. The states participate in large scale land grab movements all over, land grabs all over the world, leading to peasant suicides, farmer suicides in different parts of the country. The most important thing about the peasant movement today is the fact that it foregrounds the idea of intersectionality. So it is not only about, peasant movements today are not only about peasants. They also involve other categories of people like tribals, like indigenous people, like backward castes, people of the backward castes who are involved in land-based issues, and hence what characterizes the peasant movement is an intersectionality of interests, and that's where the significance and the future of social movements lie. For more information on peasant movements, please visit the EPG Pathshala website and apprise yourself. Thank you.